Hello everyone, and welcome to our KVEC video continuing our series related to the interdisciplinary literacy practices found in the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. As you can see on the screen, this session is for grades 6 through 12. We will be releasing K through 5 at a later time. But today we're going to look at interdisciplinary literacy practice number 3, which is view literacy experiences as transactional, interdisciplinary, and transformational. And with me today is Kim Sargent, our social studies instructional specialist. I'm going to take the time, first of all, to clarify the practice itself and the intent of the practice, and then Kim is going to share a combined literacy and social studies lesson to show you what that would look like within the classroom. Our learning goal is to build that shared understanding of the fact that a student's understanding and the use of text is dependent upon the transaction between the reader and the content of the text itself. So we're looking at reader, content, and the text itself. And what we have to remember is that when students' literacy experience, which is in any content area, when you cross those traditional disciplinary boundaries, their knowledge is expanded and more relevant for them. It's us providing a way for them to build new schema, which is connecting to what you already know. And an official definition of schema that I love to share is it is a pattern of thought that organizes categories of information and the relationship among them in the brain. Every time we as adults read anything, we try to connect it to something we already know. And a lot of times in teaching students, we forget that we are building that schema. We have lots of schema, but one of our main goals is to build that schema for our students. So, first of all, let's begin by clarifying the terminology of the practice itself. A lot of you are going to be very familiar with this, even though different terminology has been used. We want to, again, view literacy experiences as transactional. Well, this transaction values the parameters of the text you're giving students, the input of your students, what they already know, and opportunities in the classroom to build understanding. So basically, when we're talking about transactional, we're helping kids make connections, text to self, others, and the world. And then when we want students to view literacy experiences as interdisciplinary, we're asking them to cross those traditional disciplinary boundaries so that their knowledge is expanded and relevant. So in a nutshell, we want them to make connections across content areas, whether it's science and social studies, English language arts, literature, all of them. And then we want them to view literacy experiences as transformational. And this is one when we begin to think about what students write about. This is the important piece there. We want students' interactions with text to become transformational. It becomes transformational when they're motivated to pursue additional information or another activity as a result of their new schema. In other words, transaction and interdisciplinary is building more knowledge, and what do they do with that? We want them to make connections as readers and writers to their futures as contributors to stronger communities and a better world. So let's go ahead and let me give you a short resource The standards document itself is 468 pages long, so obviously you do not want to print the entire document. But what is included in the document on pages 384 to 390 is some information that clarifies the 10 practices a little further. Now, when you're looking at the box there, you're looking at, on the left side, possible teacher actions, and on the right side, possible student actions. Now, I don't want you to think this is an all-inclusive list, because there are many other ways. This is just something to help you get started, just with when you're thinking about interdisciplinary literacy practice number 3. And let's look over on the right side, the possible student actions. And let's look at the second bullet. It says, use the literary experience to either change or inform an opinion or to take action. So we're mainly, when we're looking at this, especially when we're talking about middle and high, we're talking about an argumentative type written response, because once these 3 entities come together of transactional, interdisciplinary, and transformational, the ultimate goal is a written response where they have either changed or want to inform what their opinion is. So when we're looking at these, this looks big, and it's like, well, are these separate entities? Absolutely not. And I'm going to turn this over to Kim, because she's going to show us how this looks in a classroom. She is combining literacy and a social studies lesson. So Kim?
Thank you, Carol. So when you look at this slide, you see that we're going to be talking about the Black Death, but notice that under that, there's a question. And what we call that in social studies now is a compelling question. So can disease change the world? So right off the bat, and notice that this is a much larger, broader concept. We're not focusing in on just what was the Black Death, because at that point, you've pretty much just indicated this is how far the learning is going to go. But when you say, can disease change the world, you know that the learning is going to be bigger and broader. This lesson, a good portion of it comes from c3teachers.org. So you will have access to that, and then any other resources that we have added to this lesson, you will be able to access on the link that Carol is going to send you guys. So what you're going to need for this lesson, first and foremost, is we're going to be looking at a QFT, and in this case, it's going to be a Q focus of an image and a quote. And for those of you that are not familiar with a QFT, later on in a lesson number 5, Carol's going to be talking about using the question formulation technique in the English Language Arts classroom. You're also going to need the informational text. In this case, you're going to be using the Newsella article, and you're going to annotate that, and we're going to talk about that. The C3 Teachers lesson, again, can a disease change the world? You can see that you're going to have that link even on this, but most importantly, in the folder that she's going to send you. Now, we're going to end with communicating a claim with evidence. Now, you're going to see here, we call it a claim. Same thing as an argumentative essay, because that's what it is. Because in an argumentation essay, or in a in a social studies lesson, what we're going to always be talking about is what claim does the author make. Okay, a claim is a position. So for that English language arts, that's going to look a little bit different. That's going to be, as Carol's going to explain here briefly, a thesis statement.
Right. In video number 2, we talked about how students can create, or not in video number 2, but in the writing video that has just been released. We talk about helping students to write a thesis statement. And in that training, it's a 1-hour training that teachers can use. We talk about that claim and claim statement, thesis statement actually can be interchangeable. So social studies predominantly will call it a claim, when actually it is a thesis statement, but it's based on the social studies content.
Now, for those of you that teach social studies and English language arts, maybe at middle school. What you guys will notice, especially when you look at our new standards, we have those inquiry practices. Those 4 practices are questioning, investigating through the disciplines, using evidence and communicating conclusions, which again, that could also, as part of that, is a claim. But when you see that, you can actually see that format in these things that are identified. Right off the bat, we're going to be starting with questioning. So there you go. There's the QFT. You go into the informational text. You're going to go into the lesson, can a disease change the world? And there you're actually seeing investigating through the discipline. Then you see communicating a claim with evidence. There's your using evidence component. And then lastly, extending the learning, and that's connecting to the prevention and cure of a current disease. And there you have the opportunity for students to communicate their own conclusions. After they've gone through the lesson, they've had the opportunity to extend their learning. So you can actually see that format, the inquiry practices, within just this listing of the things that we're going to do within this lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. So right off the bat, when the students come in that day, I'm going to have the room a little bit dim. So I want to recommend this for you guys because we're going to be talking about the Black Death. It can't be happy if it's the Black Death. Now this picture is going to be projected, and I'm going to have this quote. If you want to cue the creepy music, that's entirely up to you. So this is going to be up there. So the students are going to come in. Now, if you are experienced with QFT, you know that the Q focus is presented. The students have the opportunity, very briefly for a few seconds, to process it individually. You may have students produce the questions again, and lesson number 5 that you're going to be doing with Carol, you're in that practice. Number 5, you guys are going to be thinking about, well, do we, want the students to produce questions individually and then share out with small group and then large group, or do we want them to produce it small group to large group? In this case, I probably would pair the kids up because this is middle school. This is going to be a new topic. I'll probably have them in pairs. So when you look at the quotes, you have the opportunity to look at that. I may read it to the class, especially if I know I've got some students in there that are struggling readers. I'm going to read the quote to them. Now, obviously, when you look at the picture, and the few students may obsess a little bit, I'm going to say, listen, if you can read what's on the picture, then your degree is significantly higher than mine because that's Latin. So they can kind of look at this, or they're going to process it, and they're going to produce their questions. Well, ideally, what we're going to do is we go through the whole process of QFT, which when they prioritize their questions, okay, then they're going to come down to those questions that I'm going to use as supporting questions for their learning. And in this case, we're going to make believe that we've done that. And by the way, we would call this interdisciplinary, because not only is this in a social studies class, this is definitely, because we're talking about disease and the spread of disease, can also be considered, can be used in science. For those of you that are ELA, this can be used to support a novel, maybe perhaps that you're reading about the Black Death, or some other book, that novel that you've encountered and someone in the book dies of the Black Death. You can back out and support us in social studies and science and take a moment to look at the Black Death. This only takes a couple of days. So when we go into the interdisciplinary connections here, so students right off the bat are going to have their curiosity activated. And earlier, Carol brought up the idea of developing new schema. Well, in this case, that definitely is going to happen because you may have a few kids, especially if they have played Assassin's Creed, or there's another game that cannot come to mind. They have probably seen, if they have that one level of the game that does deal with a Black Death. You may have a few that are exposed to that. But in this case, so students' questions activate curiosity, so they're ready to learn about something new. So that's their new schema. This is something they've probably never heard of before. Have never heard of before. So we're going to locate sources that address the questions. That's going to be your role as the teacher. So in this case, within this inquiry, students wanted to know. So when they read the quote and looked at the picture, and by the way, that picture, if we can go back to that for just a second, Carol's going to take us back. What's going to be kind of interesting about this picture, there were several costumes this year. I actually saw this when I was out trick-or-treating, or I had trick-or-treaters come by. I saw this as a costume. So this has been introduced back into mainstream society. How interesting is that? So let's look at the questions our students produced. And of course, you did not just see me do the quotation marks. With this inquiry, students wanted to know, what were the people dying of? Where is this epidemic happening? Because that's probably going to be, they probably have a little bit of a clue, that considering that it looked like Latin and how that person was drawn out and everything. Some of the students are going to be like, well, that looks like it could be Europe. Why were friars and nuns caring for people and not doctors? Now, this is a big change. This is something that makes us very different from the medieval period. Did they find a cure? Did anyone survive this disease? And why were so many people dying so quickly? So all of those, several of those, you can see the heavy social studies focus, but most importantly, you're going to see several of these came from students that had a scientific urge to know these answers. So again, this is going to make that interdisciplinary connection within the content areas. So can a disease change the world? So we're going to first go into this lesson, and this will be in your folders. So you guys are going to have your students, and notice it says primary sources, the Black Death, 1348. So as your students take that, and again, this can a disease change the world? One thing I would really want to make a point to is that when you look at the idea of teaching to a big compelling question, think of a compelling question as this. When you look at a roadmap, because sometimes if we come in and just tell our students we're going to study the Black Death, they have no frame of reference. But if you come in and ask them a question about disease, they're going to have an immediate frame of reference. There is going to be a comfort there that is going to allow them to study much deeper and much more efficiently than if you just looked at them and said, we're going to study the Black Death. You'll get a couple of kids there because they're thinking, oh, this sounds creepy. I want to talk about it. But you're going to get other kids who are going to be uncomfortable because it's the Black Death. So that being said, when you come in and ask the question, can a disease change the world? So think of this big compelling question as your destination on the roadmap. So, when you talk about a concept, that's for us as teachers in planning. But when you ask a question like, can a disease change the world? That indicates learning. So that is the student responsibility. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use the student-generated questions to investigate. And in this case, we're going to use this informational text to establish a whole new meaning, a new schema, if you will. So each question becomes a supporting question to enable students to develop a claim in response to the compelling question. So in this case, we're going to have them look at this primary, well, it's initially a primary source, and then it goes into the informational text. So we're going to have these questions. So what we're going to do with the kids is we're going to give them this article. Then we're going to say, identify the features of this text. Do any of the subheadings hint to one of our questions? So right off the bat, when you look at this article, and for those of you that have printed this off and you're using this as you follow along with this lesson, you will see that yes, indeed, some of these subheadings actually hint to some of the questions. So the students right off the bat are going to start making connection now to the information, which is background knowledge. As you guys have seen, and as Carol has talked about in other videos, even though we want to think that this is skill-based, if the students have the background knowledge, there's going to be greater connection to the content, and most importantly, greater efficiency, not only in learning, but in writing within that topic. So we look at this. So the next thing we have is we're going to have the students annotate the article during the reading. So when we go through the close reading process, and you guys know the first time you go through to read, and then the second time you have the whole process that you follow. So as the students do that, have them annotate the article during the reading, numbering segments or paragraphs to the questions addressed. Now we can go back to that list, but you guys saw those 6 or 7 questions listed a moment ago. Those questions now are going to be written up on the board for a few days because the students always are going to have a frame of reference. They're going to have a point where they look up there all the time. Okay, what am I studying right now, and how does it relate to one of these questions that we're looking at? Because what we call that in social studies and every subject area, we call that gathering evidence, curating evidence. So if those questions, once they're written up there, stay there until your students have created their claim or communicated their conclusion or written their essay with a thesis statement. Whatever it is that you do to assess the learning, you're going to be using those questions the entire time. So they don't come down until everyone's done with the assessment. That being said, let's move on to the next part of the lesson. Oh, and we have one last thing. At this point, and this is one reason why we really like this source from Newsella, is that initially it starts off with a primary source. This gives you the opportunity because in reading and writing and in social studies, it's important to distinguish for your students and with your students the true difference between a primary and a secondary source. Primary, obviously, is first-hand account, must be. Has to be a witness in such a way that person can come away and they can write a journal, a diary, a letter. They can create a painting. They can take a picture, whatever it may be, but there has to be something that comes from that event. Then you look at the idea of the secondary source, and you guys will see that in the informational text. So because of all the reading and the learning the author has done about the Black Death, they have now created this article, and hopefully that author used numerous primary sources. So now what we've done, and you're going to see these questions again, what the students will do, and you're going to give them this, and you have this in your folder that Carol sends in the link. These are going to be the questions that are going to be addressed the entire time that we go through this lesson. So what were the people dying of? Where is the epidemic happening? And you know the rest of the questions. You guys can see that there. So as the students go through a source, they're going to write down evidence as they encounter it. The idea that we have students, go through and do all these activities or do all of these readings and everything and never be connected to the idea of using evidence really misses out on the most powerful aspect of the learning. So we've got to constantly have them connected to the text and constantly connected to why we are using the text. And in this case, we're going to do that with an information chart. Okay, so this is a fact-finding mission. Think of it that way. That we're in this process of learning, but most importantly, as we gather the information, we have to record it. So the students have the opportunity to write down the evidence that answers that question, and we always remind them, tell me the source that you used. Now, this is definitely a history and ELA thing, and of course, science too. So again, this is interdisciplinary. So when we go into investigating the questions, you guys can see here, this is the lesson that you guys will see on the link that is within the link that Carol is going to send you guys. So on the first lesson, and how many times can we say that? So that first day, so once you go through and you look at those questions the students created with QFT, those never leave. That sheet stays with the students every single day. Even though you guys will see the next day when they come into class, you're going to have this supporting question written up there, what was the Black Death? So you can see on this lesson the formative performance task, which is just another way of saying formative assessment, but we're not really going to say assessment because this is a task that the students use to process the information. They're going to be writing a description of the Black Death that includes its symptoms and where outbreaks occur in Europe and Asia, and they're going to be doing that by using source A and source B. And again, you can access that in the link. On the next day or 2 days later, however long it takes you to go through supporting question number 1, then you're going to go into supporting question number 2. So how did the Black Death spread so quickly? So understanding the spread of this disease indicates a whole lot about who we are geographically, socially, even politically, because you can see how the disease spreads along trade routes. You can also see how this disease spreads among some cities much more rapidly than it does other areas. For instance, in urban areas, people died much faster than they did in rural. That's a discussion that you can have with your students. So construct a diagram. This is going to be their task for that day. Construct a diagram illustrating how the Black Death spread. Pretty to the point, pretty much. So you look at source A, which is a visual, and source B, a map depicting the spread of the Black Death. This lesson can probably be done pretty easily in a day. Then we come to the third question was, how did the Black Death affect people in the 14th century? So they're going to create an annotated illustration. So this is an opportunity for students to create a visual that's going to help them really kind of cement the learning. So in this case, you're going to be using source A, which are statistics, source B, an illustration of the persecution of Jews, which again gets into a really great discussion or gives you the opportunity to find other sources that you can bring in to talk to the students about the beginning of anti-Semitism. And considering that this would be a probably 7th grade lesson that this would be done in, when you think about that, 6th or 7th grade, when you think about that, especially considering that in middle school, we already have to have that idea that our students, because we're required by state laws, as students shall study the Holocaust and genocide. So that being said, it gives you the opportunity to introduce the concept of anti-Semitism. And then, of course, source C, the social and economic effects of the plague. And notice this says economic there. Sometimes when we think about this, we think that there's going to be a social aspect and then there's going to be a health aspect. But there are tremendous economic changes that take place, because many times when you think about the Black Death, or what people don't sometimes think about in terms of Black Death, is that it's a seminal moment in history. It's what we call a monument. It's a marker that indicates from that point on, we are not the same as a people, and we are definitely not the same after the Black Death. So again, interdisciplinary. So now assessing and extending the student learning. It's, as Carol mentioned earlier, writing that essay is going to be a much deeper, richer experience, because you're going to know what the student knows. Most importantly, you're not only going to give them the opportunity to use this new knowledge, but you're going to give them the opportunity to support it by using evidence, which is a much more efficient way of knowing what they know than just giving them a multiple choice test. This is why in so many aspects, this now, especially when we look at our new social studies standards and the inquiry practices, it all culminates in that communicating conclusions, and there's a reason for that. A multiple choice test is not going to indicate learning. It's going to indicate memorization. But writing indicates the depth and the breadth of the learning for the student, and that is what truly informs your instruction. So when you look at this, the argument in this case is, can disease change the world? Now this, by the way, was copy and pasted directly from the C3 teacher's lesson. So that being said, construct an argument. Now, this is what you're going to give to the students. This can be written response or essay that discusses the impact of the Black Death using specific claims and relevant evidence from historical sources while acknowledging competing views that people had about the nature of the Black Death in the 14th century. Now, we're going to take the opportunity to also extend this. And this is where our science teachers or the science teacher using this lesson is going to be like, yes. Also, within social studies, this is going to be pretty important to us. So this also gives students to actually complete an extension of this lesson by maybe writing an editorial or a letter, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So in this case, we're going to extend their learning. They're going to understand. So let's talk about that. Find current examples of how we prevent, detect, and minimize the spread of diseases in homes, schools, and communities. So you can see the word here, vaccinations. Wow. I don't think I have to say a whole lot about this because you have students, by virtue of the fact that they're probably on social media pretty frequently, that are familiar with the non-vaccinators versus the vaccinators. And especially considering, for instance, the recent outbreak, and it was near epidemic proportions, if not epidemic, of measles on the West Coast because there were so many people there that did not vaccinate their children, especially for measles. Washing your hands, all those signs that start going up, that we keep up in our bathrooms. But most importantly, this time of year, I've been in schools where I've actually heard principals say, remind students, don't forget to wash your hands before lunch and when you go to the restroom, because they want to make sure, especially this time of year with the flu. So that's going to be something the students need to think about. Then let's talk about assess. So think of at least one way we might improve. So you can actually sit down and have the students now assess their school, or maybe even assess their home practices. Now, that could get interesting when the kids start going home and telling mom and dad, we're not doing things right. I'll let you deal with that. So think of at least one way we might improve the prevention or control of the spread of diseases in home, schools, and communities. Let's think about communities. How often, these students might start thinking, oh my gosh, how often does our local stores or restaurants actually go in and maybe clean up after people have been in there? What are they doing to make sure the disease does not spread? That could develop into a pretty interesting civic project for that student. Speaking of which, let's talk about ACT. Create a public service announcement to advocate for improved methods of prevention. Your class, as they're working on this, say, you know what, we're going to make bigger and better posters. We might even ask the principal if we can make those announcements during the day. They may even want to do a little pamphlet that they may pass out among, they may want to do pamphlets for different grade levels depending on the reading level of those students. They might do a cute little, just a one-sheeter for the kindergarten kids that reminds them to wash their hands, or what good practices are by using pictures. So they can kind of talk about that a little bit, but it also gives them the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to maybe do an editorial to talk about the control of diseases. You might get a student that's pretty passionate about vaccinations. So that being said, it gives them the opportunity, again, to communicate their conclusion and to support it with evidence and maybe perhaps even act on that. It's at this point now, because this student is taking this information and using it and developing an argument that is transactional. This is when they're making the big connections. This is, as it says up here, text to self, others, and the world. They're seeing the big picture, which then leads them into the transformational, okay? This is where they actually want to, as writers and readers, to impact the future. They want to make a contribution to their society. So you can see how it's transactional. They've got to have that point in their mind where they kind of change their thinking, so that way we've got them developing that argument. But once they do that, once they have their opinion and their stance, now they're able to actually engage in transformation, making a difference in their community, their state, their world.
One of the things that when we were discussing this lesson, kids have seen from day one, wash your hands, wash your hands. This is actually a lesson that gives them a chance to delve deep into why it's important just to do something as simple as wash your hands. So that becomes that transformational for it being a middle school lesson, especially. Obviously, we'd want it K-12, but this gives them the opportunity to grow and be a better contributor to the world.
Absolutely. So in this case, we think about this. So what I wanted to do, this was the earlier goal that Carol shared with you. Well, I want to look at this from like a social studies perspective. So when we think about that, the students are going to have the opportunity to build a shared understanding of the fact that a student's understanding their claim and the use of a text, they're going to be using that evidence, is dependent upon the transaction between the reader and the content of the text itself. So in this case, we're looking at primary and secondary sources. It is so important, as I've got this arrow here, centered on a question, because the question is the destination on the roadmap. When those students know what they're constantly going to be striving toward, it focuses their thinking. It gives them the opportunity not only to develop their own opinion or to develop their own claim, but it gives them the opportunity to process information in a much more focused format.
All right. Thank you very much, Kim. As we're closing out this session, as you can see, there is a Google Drive link to the resources that Kim alluded to for the primary and secondary resources. Also, if you notice within the PowerPoint itself, once you access this folder, you can access the PowerPoint, and within the PowerPoint were the direct links to the C3, the full lesson. What we've done here, obviously, is to make it doable within a short amount of time, but there are all kinds of resources located on the C3. And as usual, if you have any questions or you need feedback, there's my email address, and be watching for upcoming videos on the interdisciplinary literacy practices. Thank you all.